Hi, welcome to Plato's Cave, your speakeasy for ideas, where Tom and Dave show us how to think like the American founders. Grab a drink if you'd like. The conversation about saving our republic is about to begin.
All right, Dave, we have not been in Plato's Cave for over 2 months.
It's been a while, yeah. No, almost.
We've been
3.
We've been out in the sunlight.
Almost 3. We've been out in the sunlight.
We are bathed in truth. We're almost like Anthony Fauci. Now, Anthony Fauci is truth.
He is truth. He is science.
We left the cave and we've been bathing in truth.
Right.
Now, wait, that gets creepy because if we really carry that out, that means we've been bathing in Anthony Fauci. He said that, didn't he? Didn't he say he's truth?
He is. He's science. He said, "I am both science and truth." Now, here's the interesting question about this. So, right, I'm going to take us back to our kind of core foundational ideas. Right, we talk about truth is something that is self-evident. Yeah. Right, we have self-evident truths. Science is not always truth. Right? Science, you might believe we've had things that were scientifically believed, and then we learn later that's not the truth.
Well, if we want to be technical, there's a technical term for this. Science is empiricism, right? So science is observing things and then speculating on cause and effect in these things. Right. And very often throughout history, we've gotten things wrong, right? So many people used to believe if you fail to pray to the gods and then all of a sudden it thunders and lightning and hail comes down, they observed that and they thought, well, clearly our failure to pray to the gods led to the hail, right? And all this sort of stuff. And there are iterations of that throughout history. But it is empiricism, and the real rub is trying to figure out the causal component of that. And science is very often wrong.
And from an Aristotelian standpoint, science is the pursuit of truth.
Right.
If science is truth,
right.
If Fauci is both science and truth, that makes him God. That also makes him have no emotion, which is something we should talk about a little bit today.
Right.
But yeah, it's good to be back in Plato's Cave. It's been a long time away. I've been on the road almost 3 months, and it's nice to be back. I've been kind of getting a chance to see everybody and see friends and get to see your face again. And it's been a really nice time back.
I don't know if we told people this. So, we went to, you left earlier in the summer, and this was all revolving around, we put on a big show in Franklin, Tennessee, just outside of Nashville. And it was a great time. Dr. Carson was there with us, and we had a great turnout. The venue was gorgeous. The one downside is I returned with COVID.
Right.
For the second time. Literally the day after I got back, I could tell something was off, and sure enough, I had COVID. But you escaped it. You did not come down with it.
I escaped it. And I also escaped the house I was staying in. My friends who I was staying with, he and his daughter both were sick, not COVID, but we're both sick.
Yeah.
And I seemed to escape that pretty well too. And I did that one podcast by myself, which was a fun, interesting experience. I certainly missed having the ability to banter a little bit and talk back and forth. But I got some nice comments from some of our friends and some of our members, and it was nice. I hope they were genuine. Like I said on that podcast, I'm certainly open to criticism, especially constructive criticism. So if anybody did watch it and didn't give me feedback, I'm always looking for that. I wanted to talk a little bit about last week's podcast a little bit first. Yeah. We talked quite a bit last week about the administrative state. Challenging the administrative state was what we titled it. And the real focus there was on the IRS.
Yeah.
I heard a story last week. Yeah. This is right after our podcast. I hear this story about an IRS auditor who goes to a synagogue to audit the synagogue.
Yeah.
And he goes and he approaches the rabbi and he says, there's some irregularities on your returns here. I'd like to explore them a little bit with you. Rabbi says, okay. And he says, okay, so first you have some things on here about candles. And says, Rabbi says, yeah, we try not to waste the wax. We save all of the wax of all the candles that we take. We send them back to the candle manufacturer, and they remake candles, and they send us a free box of candles every year for returning the wax.
Yeah.
IRS agent's a little annoyed, and he says, okay. He says, how about these matzah balls? He says, well, the rabbi says after Passover every year, we collect all the crumbs from the broken matzah, from the broken crackers, and we send them back to the manufacturer, and they send us a free box of matzah balls. IRS agent's annoyed now. He hasn't been able to prove it. He says, all right, so then, Rabbi, tell me about these circumcisions. And the rabbi says, well, we take all the foreskins and we send them back to the IRS. And the agent looks at him. He says, you send them back to us at the IRS? Why? He says, well, like I said, we collect all the foreskins from these circumcisions. We send them back to the IRS. And once a year, they send us a little prick like you.
All right. That might be the most perfect Vino and Veritas Society joke. It's a good thing we're an adult organization.
That was I thought about that long and hard, but I figured in Plato's cave it's appropriate.
You should have warned people beforehand, and any kids listening, cover their ears. Well, this is an after warning. Right. Instead of a forewarning about the foreskins, it's an after warning.
It's an after warning. I appreciated the story when it was told to me.
Yeah, it's great.
So, last week's was really interesting. I was really glad we got to dig into that whole idea of this expanding bureaucratic state, this new Inflation Reduction Act, which thank goodness, I think I saw a stat, 83% of Americans have said this does nothing to curb inflation.
Sure.
Even certain senators are now saying on the left, are saying this is the greatest win for climate change. The Inflation Reduction Act is the greatest win for climate change in the history of the world.
Yeah, and even that, right? If you really dig into it, it's not a win for actually changing the climate. What it's really a win for, it's a win for government programs, government agencies, government bureaucracies whose jobs are justified by the label climate change. That's who it's really, a victory for. And just to sort of recap what we talked about last week, and look, this is an ongoing subject that Americans should always be aware of. And that is the administrative state. It's not merely gigantic. Mm-hmm. It is gigantic. It's not merely gigantic. It's not merely unconstitutional. It's not merely wasteful and full of corruption.
Right.
It's not merely counterproductive. Very often, we create huge agencies, huge programs to do things like, solve the problem of poverty, and we end up incentivizing more poverty and all kinds of social pathologies to go along with it. It's all those terrible things. And that big administrative state has become a player in our politics.
Right.
Arguably the biggest player. Certainly the player with the most resources at its disposal. Most people, when you think about getting into politics, you think about who your opponent's going to be, right?
Sure.
It's people running against you for a particular office. Most people are not thinking, oh, and I also have this administrative state out there, which might come harass me, which might try to shut down my business to teach me a lesson, which might get, embarrassing information about me and leak it to the New York Times and the Washington Post and all those kinds of, they might come raid my house.
I was just going to say that.
Right. All those sorts of things. And so you have this sprawling monstrosity that wastes money and incentivizes corruption and hurts people. And it now is a player in our politics. Right. That problem is a problem. I would argue that is the single greatest political problem that we have in the United States.
And beyond that, they're now engaging in every aspect of our lives, right? We've talked about this, how progressivism has made politics involved in every aspect of our lives. Not only are they now engaged in politics and our competitors politically, there are competitors in business. We talked last week a little bit about how the EPA was just given a climate bank in this new Inflation Reduction Act, somehow giving the climate or giving the EPA $20 billion for a bank.
And imagine if someone, this is very much possible, and I'll give some examples that I know for facts are real. Imagine a group of friends, of investors, has been putting together a business plan, and they said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go create our own bank.
Yep.
And we care about the environment.
Yep.
We are going to look for green energy businesses, environmentally friendly businesses. And we want to offer loans at very competitive rates. And we're going to specialize in that way. And that's our business model.
Mm-hmm.
And we have investors pumping in a bunch of money. We're going to make loans. And when we get those loans repaid, that's how the bank is going to be profitable and everything. And along comes Congress and says, we're going to create a bank for the EPA that never has to make a profit.
Right.
It never has to make a profit because it's bankrolled by the United States Treasury, right? It's bankrolled by taxpayers. And imagine if you had just launched this bank and you're sitting there looking at that thinking, how do I compete with that? How do I compete with the EPA? It reminds me, I've known this to happen in multiple cities. It's hard to believe now, Dave, because I'm getting old, but I've actually been involved in the world of like fitness and working out in gyms for most of my life. And I have seen this happen over and over. Somebody really gets into fitness. They decide to open their own gym. They quit their regular job. They pour all their capital, max out their credit cards, right? Take out a loan. They buy a building, buy the equipment. They open a beautiful, shiny gym. And then the city where they live, they decide to open a rec center right down the street.
Right.
And the rec center, you either pay nothing or you pay, $5 a month.
At most,
right? Yeah. Where no privately owned gym can possibly compete with that. Yep. And that's all taxpayer subsidized. That's how they can charge no money or very little money. And so you're right. The administrative state it's a player in our politics, and it wants to win. It wants to protect its own interests. It wants to destroy any candidate out there that is threatening the administrative state. Mm-hmm. And it is also competing in the business realm. And it's doing it in ways that are, by definition, inefficient. It's always inefficient because when you have the power to just take money from taxpayers, right? You don't have to be efficient. You don't have to sit there and watch real closely, right? What are my costs? What are my revenues, right? And try to be as efficient as possible. You don't have to do any of that when you're a government agency because you just go take more money from the people when you need it.
Wouldn't it be amazing if for the Vino Veritas Society, we could just go out to all Americans and say, you really need somebody talking in Plato's Cave every day. You really need this. This is in your best interest. These conversations. Now, whether you decide to use them or not, whether you decide to listen to them or not and apply them to your daily lives, that's your problem. We don't care. Right. You need this. So we're going to tax you.
That's right.
We're going to tax you. Man, running this business would be easy.
Oh, it'd be a walk in the park, wouldn't it? And so all these problems are inherent in this idea of a big sprawling, bureaucratic state. We're talking beyond the constitutional parts of government, right? The Constitution does say there's going to be a Congress, right? And it says there's going to be a Supreme Court and there's going to be a president. But, those three institutions combine, 535 in Congress, right? And 9 justices on the court. So that's 544 and 1 president. Right. That's 545 people in the government that are necessary under the Constitution. Mm-hmm. And we now have millions of unelected bureaucrats doing all kinds of things, competing in the political realm, competing in the business realm, issuing regulations, offering subsidies that fuel all kinds of corruption. And this is the swamp. This is what we're up against today.
And the corruption is really where you get concerned. For me, at least, that's that's sort of the last line. That's you've crossed the line. All of those other things are terrible. And then you start seeing the corruption, and that's where I start getting really angry. And the perfect example, this EPA bank, here's where this worries me as the EPA bank, because here's what's going to happen. There are several now publicly traded ETFs. These are traded funds where you have multiple companies. Have you seen these on the stock market? Yeah. You have multiple companies that fall into these portfolios, and you can just buy the portfolio. These ETFs can be invested in by anybody, including somebody like Paul Pelosi and Paul Pelosi Jr.
Right.
And then what happens when Nancy Pelosi then calls somebody at the EPA and says, hey, there are these 6 companies I want you to give them each $1 billion loan, interest free for the next 30 years. And no questions asked.
Right.
What's going to happen to the stock price?
Right.
When that comes out that these companies have all been awarded $1 billion interest-free loans from the EPA because they're doing good for the climate.
But Dave, here's the good news. Paul Pelosi, this is Nancy Pelosi's husband. Mm-hmm. He can't possibly know about that before you or I know about it. So, right, we're all going to be investing in these companies on an even level playing field, right?
The only thing that's going to stop him. Did you see he got a DUI a couple weeks ago and now might be going to jail?
Oh no,
they're trying to keep him out of jail. We'll see how much sway Nancy Pelosi really has. He was way over the legal limit, and anybody else would have gone to prison for what he got.
Well, if he doesn't go to prison, right? I mean, I was being facetious.
I know
there.
You were.
The point is, he'll know. He's an insider.
Yeah.
He's married to a high-ranking member of Congress. He'll know exactly what's going on over at the EPA and the EPA bank, and he'll know the companies that are getting. And so when their stock price is still real low, he'll go buy up a whole bunch of it. Then they get these big loans or these big contracts or whatever it is, and the value of those companies go through the roof. Then he sells off his share and he becomes a millionaire. He becomes wealthy. It reminds me, I just saw a little ad on social media by our friend in Congress, Miss Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I'll admit, Dave, I'm a man who knows himself. It always catches my eye because I think she's just a little cute. I might have a little crush on her. Now, everything she represents is the demise of the United States. I mean, it's the end of our constitutional republic. And she had this ad that was actually dead on accurate. It was right. And the ad was about how appalling it is. And she's saying this as a member of Congress. She's there herself. And she said, it is appalling that more than half of the members of Congress are millionaires, and they've become millionaires while in Congress. They didn't become millionaires by running successful businesses, by being inventors or entrepreneurs or, no. They're getting wealthy because they have access to government power. Sure.
And
they can sell government favors and government contracts. They can sell regulations or make sure a regulation doesn't get passed or is delayed these are the kinds of favors that they can offer. And this is how they get wealthy. And she was saying, this is appalling. And I actually agree with her. That is right. It is appalling. And, here's one of the most important lessons about government we can offer. That kind of insider, people in the government using the powers of government for their own advantage, that has always existed.
Yep.
And it always will exist wherever you have government. I'm reminded, one of the most explosive public policy disputes that resulted in nothing less than the Civil War was when old Stephen A. Douglas from Illinois, he pushed ahead this bill called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. We don't have to go into the details, but what it did, the Americans had agreed to a policy to stop the spread of slavery out into the Western territories. All Americans were happy with that. And he passes this thing and it repeals that prohibition. All of a sudden, it opens the whole Western territory to slavery. And for years, right, people wonder, why would he do that? He was not a pro-slavery. He didn't care about it. He said, I just don't care. But
he was pro-choice.
He was pro-choice. I mean, he didn't own slaves.
Yeah.
He himself was not in the slave business. So why would he do that? And it turns out, we learned much later, Stephen Douglas, as a member of the United States Congress, who he was talking to during that time? This big territory. This was like the Kansas territory and the Nebraska leading out to the western part of the United States. He's talking to the guys, the survey teams who work for the railroad companies. And they're out there surveying and they're drawing lines on maps saying, here's where a railroad should be built. Can't be built here, has to be built here because of various, geological formations and things. And he's buying land. Stephen A. Douglas is looking at that map and he's buying up land right where the railroads are going to be laid, because he knows he can buy that land dirt cheap. It's just a prairie, and eventually towns are going to crop up and that land will be much more expensive. And the rub was, you can't build railroads until you have some kind of territorial government out there to protect the workers. There's some hostile Indian tribes and other dangers out there. You need some kind of government presence, some kind of police presence out there. And he was desperate to just get these territories settled, get a territorial government out there so we can start building the darn railroads so he can get wealthy. That was that's 1854, right? And so this kind of corruption goes on all the time. We can never get rid of it. No amount of regulations is going to get rid of it. The only thing we can do is we can keep the size and scope and money involved in government small, and then there's not that much corruption possible. But as it grows, the more power government has, the more resources it has, the more opportunities for corruption, and the higher level, the greater the amounts of corruption you'll find.
Well, you're talking about the 1840s, 1850s with Stephen Douglas, which in the grand scheme of the world isn't that long ago. But go into the very mantra of the Vino Veritas Society, to our very basic ideas, Nos sumus custodes. Who will guard us from the guardians? Juvenal, the philosopher, knew about this. Aristotle talked about this. They knew that these people in government, it's interesting. One of the foundational ideas and one of the first seminars you created for our academy section on our website was talking about how the foundational idea of our Declaration of Independence is that human nature never changes, And the progressive view of human nature is that human nature evolves. You want proof that human nature never changes? Legislators who are supposed to be protecting the welfare of the people they represent will always look for ways to steal and skim off the top. They will always look for it. They did it in Juvenal's time. They did it in Aristotle's time. They did it in Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln's time, and they're still doing it today.
And they will never say, I'm stealing because I'm greedy and I don't want to get my grubby hands on it.
It's for your welfare.
It's for you. I'm doing this because I care for you.
And so the irony of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is she's sitting there and she's making these commercials saying exactly what you said. And you're sitting there saying, I agree with that. But you know what she's also saying at the same time? She's sitting there telling you, I'm here protecting you from that, and I don't make nearly enough money for that. The 6-figure salary plus the per diem and all the perks I get as a congressman, it's not nearly enough. We need to double the salary of congressmen. I don't make enough money. The $5,000 or $6,000 a month apartment that I'm living in New York, in addition to the thousands of dollars that she spends on her second home in the DC area, that doesn't nearly pay me enough. I need to make a lot more money, and I've got people to take care of, and they rely on me. Meanwhile, what is she doing that's productive? What value is she providing? I'm going to
make a prediction. If she stays there for say 12 years or more, it's very likely she might. She has a big fan base. There's a group of people out there who want her to be there and send money to her and support her in many ways. If she stays there for 12 years or more, my prediction is she will become a very wealthy member of Congress. She'll join that millionaire club. And it is not because she's running a successful business. It's not because of her real estate deals or oil deals. It's not because she's going to invent some new widget or technology or something like that. It's going to be because she trades in government favors.
You know what else it's going to be? She's going to do what Bernie Sanders did. She's going to take the taxpayer dollars that are paying her salary, and she's going to go hire some ghostwriter to write a book for her. And that ghostwriter is going to write a book, and she's going to start publishing a bunch of books that a bunch of people who say, I love Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I want to buy her book, and she's going to make millions of dollars that have allowed Bernie Sanders to. I don't know. We don't have a whole lot of evidence of Bernie Sanders, of all people, trading in government favors, right? There's a lot to not like about Bernie Sanders, but he's certainly not in this Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Jerry Nadler world of trading favors.
Well, I think the biggest example at all, and I don't know. I'm curious if any of our members know if a good documentary has been made about this. I don't know. It's the Clintons. I mean, the Clintons are probably prime example number one. I mean, they were so obvious about it, right? It was right there in our face. When they're in positions of great, high-ranking government power, what do? They go and open a charitable organization. Give us money. And they would brag. Progressives would brag how, did you see Bill Clinton got paid? He would get paid these exorbitant amounts of money for a 30-minute speech. Mm-hmm. Is it because Bill Clinton was such a great genius and had some insight that would illuminate the minds of millions? No, it had nothing to do with this. They didn't care what he talked about. He could have stood there and read the phone book. When they paid him those big, $500,000, $1 million speaking fees, what they were getting for that money was access to government favors, including when Bill Clinton's wife was Secretary of State. So foreign governments that want some kind of special treatment from the United States State Department, they want some kind of grant. They want, I don't know, call me crazy. Maybe it's Ukraine looking for big wads of money to come to Ukrainian oil companies where people like Joe Biden's son sits on their boards, right? Those kinds of things. They would pay money to the Clinton Foundation because they were buying direct access to the United States State Department. And here's what was fascinating about that story. The moment, and I mean the moment, both Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton were no longer in a position of power, that whole organization folded up and went away. Right. There was no reason anymore. Now, when people, if people want to justify it and say, no, people really were paying for the brilliance of Hillary Clinton or Bill Clinton. That's why they were paying them $500,000 to speak.
I have to laugh at that. I know. Just the mere idea of that.
But if you go along with that, just for a second or two, and then you realize, well, once they got out of office, they still had the same mind. Hillary Clinton still had the same mind the day after she was no longer Secretary of State. She had the same knowledge. She had the same mind. So did Bill Clinton when he was no longer president. Why did nobody want to pay them $500,000, $1 million for little speaking gigs? Because they no longer could open the door to government agencies, to the federal government of the United States. That's really the ticket to getting rich in the modern world. It reminds me of my old friend Bert Folsom, who I haven't seen for a long time, and I love recommending his work because Bert he's a solid historian. Many people confuse him as an economist. He's not an economist. He's a historian with a very peculiar specialty. His specialty is the history of economics. So Bert knows, for example, the history of the tax code, inside and out, the history of American financial policy, the history of the economic health of the United States and other nations. He knows this stuff really well. And he wrote a book years ago, short little book. It's a beautiful book titled The Myth of the Robber Barons. Right. As growing up as a student of history, he'd always heard this disparaging term, robber baron. Guys like Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller, they were barons in the sense they were kind of royalty. They were like American royalty. But the way they got there to be royal was by robbing. They were robber barons. And he went and looked at them to see, how did these guys actually get wealthy? And what he found in most cases, is they were entrepreneurial, they were inventive, and they figured out ways to deliver better quality products at lower prices. And millions of Americans said, that's a great value for us. We'll buy those products and services. So it was good for America and it was good for them. And right up front, Bert makes a distinction. In fact, I think it's on the very first page, between market entrepreneurs versus political entrepreneurs. A market entrepreneur is someone who goes out into a market. You go out into the restaurant market, right? You go out into the steel making market, right? Or the clothes making market, and you compete against the other people making those products or offering those services. And those people actually create, the successful ones, create real value. Sure. Versus the political entrepreneurs, they don't go into any market. They're not producing anything. they do what they have to do to get their hands on the levers of government power.
Sure.
And now they can offer access to the lever. You need a regulation, you need a subsidy, you need a special contract. Oh, you're my brother-in-law and you're making hammers for $600 a hammer, and you'd like to sell 10 million of them to the United States Navy, right?
Yeah.
Come, I got my hand on this lever. I can make that happen.
Yep.
That's the kind of cronyism that the administrative state fuels.
Well, and that was the underlying story of Whitewater with the Clintons,
That's
right?
right.
You're going back to Clintons, and you talk about it. You don't know if there were movies. There were a couple of great documentaries made on what happened with Whitewater, and that's a longer conversation that I think we have time for it in a podcast.
Right.
But I would certainly recommend people going back to watch it. And then at the same time, now you were also starting to see, and we're still seeing, this happening on a global scale, right? And this whole idea of the globalization of the markets, it has become easier for people like Hillary Clinton to not just do a favor for somebody here, because it's easier to track somebody on U.S. soil who got some favor and did it through paying off a politician. So now she starts going overseas, and there's a lot of claims about who was the ambassador in the Benghazi story who was killed. First name was Chris. I can't remember his last name off the top of my head, but a lot of people are saying he was there. He said he was there trying to promote peace in the area and everything else. There's a lot of documentation that says he was there facilitating an arms deal, that a United States company was selling arms through favors by Hillary Clinton to groups in Benghazi. And that's what brought him there. And he was overseeing the facilitation of this arms deal. And that's when you start to get, okay, now we really have this idea of robber barons, right? And you and I talked about this in a podcast years ago. I mean, probably a year and a half ago. And we probably should have done a better job of sticking to this. We wanted to redefine the politicians as the robber barons, right? Not just, it wasn't Carnegie and those guys who are the robber barons. It's the Nancy Pelosi's and the Hillary Clintons and the people who are using the powers of government to rob Americans of their tax dollars and use them to help benefit their friends. That's the real robber baron in the story.
You're absolutely right. And it goes, I mean, there's direct corruption. Pay me a bribe. If I'm a government official, pay me a bribe and I'll make sure your company gets this contract. Then there's more subtle, harder to detect. Pay me a bribe and I'll make sure that this regulatory agency goes and audits for compliance your competitor.
Right.
And that is going to tie them up for the next 2 years just dealing with those bureaucrats. Meanwhile, you can outperform them and crush them in the marketplace because they're going to be so worried about violations from these regulatory agencies. There's a book I've actually just started. I don't want to say too much about it because I haven't read enough to recommend or not recommend it. But the topic is the whole opioid crisis. And what it features, it actually revolves around a pretty small number of players. You have a handful of big pharmaceutical companies, and you have only a handful because it's so heavily regulated. It's virtually impossible to start up a new pharmaceutical company. You have to have enormous amounts of resources just to meet the compliance of starting a pharmaceutical company before you even sell one pill, right, or one shot or anything else. So where you find heavily regulated industries like pharmaceuticals, you also find a very small number of gigantic companies. You don't find a whole bunch of small and medium-sized companies competing. You find just a few. And then you have a handful of distribution companies, also highly regulated. You want to transport pills and medicines, right? It's very regulated, which means there are very few. And then you have the regulatory agencies, and these agencies, they're filled with people. Number one, some of them used to work for the pharmaceutical companies, and now they work at the FDA. What's even more common is the other way.
FDA.
They used to work at the FDA. The very agents who were investigating Johnson & Johnson to make sure Johnson & Johnson is in compliance now work at Take a guess. Somebody take a guess.
Johnson.
At Johnson & Johnson, right? And so that they can guide Johnson & Johnson through the whole process in a way that, right, you and I can't go hire a bunch of ex-bureaucrats who used to work at the FDA. Johnson & Johnson can.
Sure.
And those bureaucrats now working within the pharmaceutical companies, they know right where the line is. They know, right, you can do all these things and nothing's actually going to happen. The FDA is not actually going to do anything to you. And even when they do things to them, they can say, you can go do all these things. You can flood the market. You can send all these pills out to people, including people who don't need them, and get a bunch of people strung out on drugs. And you might get fined $1 million. So, these companies sit and look at it. Well, we can make $70 billion in revenue and pay this $1 million fine. Sure, we'll pay that fine all day. We'll pay that fine every day of the week.
That whole concept started with Philip Morris, right? So this was, I remember one of my first seminar courses of my master's degree. I was getting my MBA, and we had these giant first semester of your MBA. You sit in these large scale seminars, and they do almost like singular topics once a week, and you just go in once a week. It's a low credit class, but everybody has to take it. One of the first ones was the accounting analysis of Philip Morris putting a Surgeon General label on a pack of cigarettes before it was required.
Yeah.
And the commercials, the advertising that they ran, advertising the health dangers of smoking cigarettes. Why? Because they were starting to get threats of lawsuits.
Right.
And there were people lining bureaucrats' pockets and politicians' pockets saying, we want you to take these guys out. They're killing people. We want you to take them out. We want to come in with a safer cigarette or a less hazardous cigarette. Go take Philip Morris out, because they were the giant in the room. And Philip Morris said, well, if we advertise that smoking is hazardous to your health, then you can't really sue us. If we're telling you, if we're being honest with you and saying, you're going to die from smoking cigarettes, but if you want to, man, do they taste good? And do they make you feel good? And do they make you look cool? Right? So all of those things. And they did the analysis, and it was going to cost them tens of billions of dollars at a time when that was Elon Musk kind of money. Right. It was going to cost them so much money in the lawsuits that it made sense for them to spend $50 million a year on advertising. To just offset all of that.
There's a little fictionalized account of that story in the series Mad Men.
Right.
The main guy, Don Draper, is an ad executive, and so I don't remember what it's in one of the later seasons. And all this pressure is coming back because one of their main clients is a cigarette company, and they're getting all this pressure. Cigarettes cause cancer and kill people and everything. And he makes exactly this all on his own. He runs a big full page ad in the New York Times about all the health risks of smoking cigarettes, precisely this, to head this off. And their sales go up.
Well, because they still do the imagery surrounding that small little message, right? You make the message really small, and then the imagery is either the cool cowboy, the Marlboro Man, Joe Camel, or the woman's smoking, what was it, Pall Malls?
I think it's Virginia Slims.
Virginia Slims.
You've come a long, isn't that their tagline? You've come a long way, baby.
Don't remember that.
I think it was.
I don't remember that. So it's just an interesting analysis, and it even starts to bleed into now what we're seeing in politics too, right? I mean, you talk about, hey, I'm gonna fund you, and I want you to go after my competitor in business. No, or I want you to go after my political competitor.
And yet, right? And yet, there is this view. This is another one of these great. There are these great persistent myths out there in our American culture today, and they're persistent. They last over years, in some cases decades. One of them being that the bureaucratic class is more intelligent, they're more thoughtful, they're more earnest and forthcoming. They're the scientists,
right?
And they're a special kind of scientist, Dave, because there are scientists at Philip Morris, and there are scientists at Johnson & Johnson, and all these other, they have scientists. See, Dave, they're motivated by a profit. Like, they care about making a profit.
Right.
And that profit motive, they will lie, they will falsify their research because they have these interests. Now, this is part of the myth.
Yeah.
The myth is the scientists in government The bureaucrats, they don't have interests.
Right.
Well, their only interest is you and me and our fellow citizens. The common good is their only interest. They don't stand to make any extra money or get any extra power. There's nobody trying to bribe them or steer their research or influence the regulations that they pass. And so they really come to embody the concept of science, the concept of truth. And we've just found out that Mr. Truth, Mr. Science himself, science. Do you know this, Dave? Science is retiring.
So nothing else to learn in the world.
That's right.
We've figured it all out.
He's retiring. He also goes by the name Anthony Fauci.
Right.
But he has described him. He has said, "I am science." And he has also said, "I am truth." My very being, the fiber of what I am is truth. And he's retiring. But I think millions of Americans buy into that. They actually think that if someone works for God, I've had these many conversations where I'll cite something that either a company or even a think tank that specializes in thinking, in researching. And I'll cite something one of them has produced, maybe in a white paper or a presentation. And many of my progressive friends instantly will reject it. Well, you can't believe that think tank. They have a political interest they're trying to promote. You can't believe the business. They have profit motives they're trying to promote. But a statement, a policy, a regulation that comes from an unelected bureaucratic agency, millions of our fellow citizens right now just assume without any question, well, that has to be true. That has to be true. That's from the government. I mean, the government, they can't be wrong. I mean, it's the government, Dave. They can't be wrong. And
they've never been wrong before.
Never been wrong. And they certainly wouldn't lie. Like they wouldn't purposefully, knowingly say things that weren't true to people. And that too is one of this huge problems that we're up against, because when you get a gigantic administrative state with almost unlimited resources and funds, think of how much money, right, the federal government has at its disposal, and they enter the political realm, they're going to start fighting with other people's, we mentioned this before, and it's worth repeating, not in traditional ways, right? They're not the FDA or the EPA or the IRS. They're not going to run a traditional political they're not running for office. What they will do is they will do whatever they can to discredit their political opponents in the political realm. And in terms of discrediting, they have all kinds of resources at their disposal. So you have this administrative state with huge resources coming into the political realm, fighting with, trying to discredit and destroy political opponents. And a huge number of our citizens think that the opponents, the politicians, well, they're all corrupt and dishonest but they look at that administrative state as the beacon of purity and truth, right, and science. And I think one of the most important services we can perform at the Vino and Veritas Society is to disabuse Americans of that mistake, of that prejudice. No, you know what you find in these agencies? People. Right. And just like people everywhere, they respond to incentives. They have interests. They're going to try to get ahead. If they can get a promotion, if they can get a pay raise, if they can make a little money under the table by making something happen, by delaying a regulation or by auditing one group and not auditing someone else, will they do that? Absolutely.
Well, that's perhaps what's most disappointing about the way progressives in our country today analyze this whole situation. For some reason, and I can't understand it. I honestly cannot understand it. Those in government today can do no wrong, but those in government 240 years ago were all wrong. Everything that George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, everything they did was wrong.
They were racist, Dave.
They were racist. They could do nothing good.
Right.
But now today, you have people in government and everything they do is right. Is all good. Yeah. But here's the problem. The people today keep making mistakes. We have cited over and over and over again. There's been the war on poverty the war on drugs, all of these things that we have thrown billions or trillions of dollars at, that the government has failed.
Right here where we are today, we're sitting here with record inflation coupled with all kinds of shortages. Shelves are barren in the stores. We can't get things, parts that people need. We can't get them. All these very real problems that were started with lockdowns and shelter at home commands, edicts. And we now have large databases, not just from across the United States, but from around the world, that demonstrate the lockdowns did not work for their own purposes. They said lockdowns will keep us safe from COVID. Shutdowns will keep us safe from COVID. It turns out many of the places that had the strictest shutdown orders, stay at home, shelter at home orders were the ones that have been ravaged by COVID.
To the point that even a state like New York just announced their new COVID policies for schools this year. If a student gets COVID, it's 5 days at home, and then they're supposed to come back. If they're exposed to COVID, right? It used to be if you were exposed to COVID 2 weeks,
right?
Don't come near. If you're exposed to COVID but test negative, you're expected in school. You are not supposed to take time off. Now, they would like you to wear a mask for 5 days if you were exposed to COVID. And the conversation that Kathy Hochul, the governor, has said is it's because of the damage that keeping kids out of school has done.
Right.
So all of these mistakes, and we've seen now the CDC and everything else, they admitted all these lockdowns and the masking guidelines and everything else were wrong. They said you get vaccinated and you can't get COVID. And now you've got people who have been, you get all these shots and you're still getting COVID.
Here's the other piece. I know you have a bigger point to make, but while we're on the subject, we should remind people, even the best kind of scientist, the best kind of researcher, that person might be able to give you sound advice, do these things, and you're less likely to get COVID, or you're less likely to be healthy. For that matter, they can say, do these things, and it's more likely your parachute will open if you jump out of a plane with a parachute. Do these things, and you're less likely to fall and crash while you're riding your bicycle, right? There's all kinds of good sound advice. But one thing no scientist can ever figure out is how much risk are you willing to take, Dave?
Right.
How much this one good thing, how does that compare to you? How does that compare to this more risky thing? You could lock yourself in a hyperbolic tube, right? And you're not going to get COVID because it can't come into the tube. You just lie there in a dark tube, right? Or you go see some friends at a restaurant and you see your buddies and talk and socialize and have some good food. How do those two experiences compare to you? And then whatever the answer is, how do they compare to someone else?
Right.
There might be someone who says, I am terrified of COVID, terrified. If the tube will keep me safe from COVID, then I'm going to live in the tube. Okay. But there might be someone else who says, seeing my friends and having dinner is way more valuable to me than living in the tube.
Right.
I'm willing to risk it, even if I get COVID.
And if that group all decides, it went even beyond just the individual. If each individual in that group decides, you know what, we're okay with it, and we'd rather our kids be socialized together and get an education in a group. So we're going to create a homeschool pod, and they're going to get educated together.
Right.
Nope, you can't do that because we say so. And the bigger point here is, the government has made mistake after mistake after mistake. When you point that out today, and then you go look on Twitter at the people who are pointing that out, every response is, guys, they did their best with the knowledge that they had. Anthony Fauci did the best with the knowledge that he had at the time. Let's not forget the first 3 or 4 months of COVID, from about December of 2019 until at least February. Trying to remember the date. Trump did the State of the Union in February of 2020.
Okay.
And that he mentioned COVID. He mentioned a virus coming from China, COVID-19 virus coming from China. This is the infamous State of the Union speech that Nancy Pelosi tore up
Right.
afterward, he actually talked about the threat of COVID.
Right.
And right after that, Anthony Fauci went onto television and said, it's nothing to worry about.
Right.
It can't be airborne. You
Right.
can't catch it through the air. Just make sure you wash your hands a lot. Everybody will be fine.
Yeah.
Don't go buy masks. We need to save them for the hospitals. I mean, he made no big deal about this.
So, I'm a big fan when it comes to political, cultural things. I often think of these things in terms of judo or jujitsu, trying to use someone else's energy and momentum, right, against them and to help protect myself. So if progressives come along and say, well, look, these guys did the best they could with the information they had at the time.
Yeah.
Here's the judo part. Say, okay, you're right. They did. So can we all agree when these bureaucrats come out, number one, the information they have at any given moment is insufficient.
Right.
They never have total, complete knowledge. There can always be more to learn. And number two, therefore, they can give advice if they want. They should be issuing no regulations. Nothing that has the power of law. They don't get to command people. If they want to serve as advisors, public health advisors, we think right now, we don't think this can be airborne, or we think it can be airborne.
Right.
And here's what might protect you. Okay, go ahead and give your opinion. But don't come out as our governing lords and say, you are going to wear a face mask because that face mask stops. No, you don't. You don't even know that. So back off, bub, right? Stop with the arrogance. Don't think you're going to command my life. Speculate, and we'll continue to speculate on our own.
And don't listen to somebody who just flat out says, I know the truth and no one else does.
Yeah, right.
If Anthony Fauci says, I am truth, I know the truth and no one else can know it, that is the antithesis of the definition of truth. The truth is something that we can know, right? At its very core. And if he knows it, none of us can know it without listening to what he says.
Yeah,
there's a problem there.
It goes back to we haven't used this term in a while, but it's so revealing and it's so central to all this. The term central planning, the idea of central planning. This is the fatal Achilles heel that can never be overcome. This problem can never be solved. The problem of knowledge in central planning can never be solved. Nobody, not even the smartest person in the world, not even the great Anthony Fauci. It is impossible for him to know what other people value, what risks other people are willing to take, what they want. Number one, all those things change. What they want one day might be different from what they want another day. What they value, how much risk they're willing to take in one moment might change to the next moment. And that's impossible for any central planner to know these things. And we have these genuine, horrific, nightmarish examples of this that we have lived through over the last century. We've seen these attempts at central planning. We've seen the failure of knowledge that always happens with central planning. So the Soviets said the best way to produce shoes is through central planning. We're going to produce shoes for the people. We don't need a bunch of different shoe companies compete. Right? We're going to have our experts figure out what the best kind of shoe is and the most efficient way to make shoes. And we're going to make shoes for all the Soviet people. All of our comrades will have shoes. So these shoes would show up, and one person might like them, and 10 other people said, these shoes are horrible. I hate them because they're ugly. They don't fit my feet because they're uncomfortable, right? I can't stand them. They wanted some options and selections, and there was no way for a central planner to know what all these different people wanted and need. That's just with shoes. Now multiply that with everything else in life, and you start to see this fatal defect in central planning. And yet in the modern world, Dave, this is the tragedy of our times. We're like moths attracted to a candle. We keep going back to the light of the candle, which burns you when you get too close. We keep migrating. The progressive modern world keeps migrating back towards that idea of central planning. Well, let's just have some central planning in medicine, or let's just have some central planning in education. You run into that same core problem of central planning. It doesn't matter what industry it is or what area of life it is. It's always there.
Well, then you've also noticed, and I don't think we've really talked a lot about this in the past, the central planners are growing in numbers significantly, right? I mean, you always talk about how many bureaucrats there are, but that number is growing exponentially every year. And we've talked a lot in the past about the mob mentality, right? So when somebody like an Anthony Fauci says, here's the right call, here's what we should do, here's how I'm going to plan for everybody's needs, he has now millions of other central planners around him agreeing with him and creating that mob mentality and creating all of that. And this is where I got really disturbed with some of the conversation about Anthony Fauci. So we started our whole conversation today about Anthony Fauci's retiring. And some people are like, that's awesome. Get rid of him. He's gone. I will always go down saying this was the worst decision that Ronald Reagan ever made, and that was hiring Anthony Fauci. Although you'd probably make an argument that if it wasn't Fauci, it would have been somebody else. There would have been somebody else in that role.
Remember, Anthony Fauci was the guy in the mid-1980s when the whole AIDS scare came out. Anthony Fauci went public and said, within a household, within a family, like, don't spend time in the kitchen cooking with someone who has AIDS or you'll get AIDS too, right?
Right.
I mean, it triggered all this backlash against, you mean if I'm anywhere close to someone who has AIDS? Oh, and a lot of those people who have AIDS are homosexuals. Ergo, right, for a whole lot of people, it didn't take long to reach the conclusion, I can't be anywhere around homosexuals because I will get AIDS. That came from Anthony Fauci.
He made them pariahs. And now we're doing the exact opposite when it comes to monkeypox. It's like we were so bad at it in the 80s that now we're going to go completely the other direction and not even recognize the connection. And it's lacked this ability to separate the two things, right? You can accept that something is often being transmitted through a certain community for a certain activity. Without having to dislike that community and without having to make them out to be pariahs. The bigger point is Anthony Fauci has now said, I am dedicating the rest of my life to I'm not going away and living on a beach somewhere, right? I'm retiring, but he says, I'm not retiring in the traditional sense. I'm going to write and I'm going to teach, and I'm going to go encourage children to enter government service. What is he doing? He's expanding the bureaucracy. He's going to you're going to go hire 87,000 new IRS agents. You have to have people who want those jobs. The best thing we could do, if they want to pass this law that says we're going to approve 87,000 new IRS agents, the best thing Americans could do is say, screw you, I don't want that job. I don't want to work for the IRS.
Wouldn't that be great if those 87,000 positions remain unfilled?
We can't find anybody to work for the IRS. So what do they start doing? They start eliminating other jobs. They hurt the economy so that people have to go find these jobs. And that's where central planning gets really dangerous. But he's going to go out and he's going to encourage children so that as children grow up, they want these jobs. So as Joe Biden and his acolytes and Obama and his acolytes start creating these government jobs, there are plenty of people to fill them.
You know, Dave, I want to sort of wrap things up here with just a little thought experiment, a little challenge for our members. And this is not an easy thing to really think through. And I would ask our members to step back, take a deep breath. Don't get in. I don't mean to be insulting here. I mean this as a real challenge. For many decades in the United States, it was common for children to look up to police officers, firemen, people like that who are government employees, and think that I want to do that someday. There's something noble. There's something good about that. Have we reached a point where the administrative state is now engulfing everything and suffocating us and smothering us? Have we reached a place where what we really need to do is teach children? That's kind of a shameful, embarrassing thing to go work for the government. If you're almost presented like like a drug dealer or a prostitute, right? Like if you're really down on your luck and there's nothing else you can do and you're kind of stupid and you're kind of slow and you don't have many talents, go work for the government.
Right.
But but if at all possible, right, do something else, do something productive, work for an organization that actually produces value for people rather than gets paid to harass people and take their money away.
Well, and its foundation, and you just opened up a huge can of worms that we're not going to take the time to go into, but you really make a good point here that I want to extrapolate just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
These jobs, there's no competition for. Right? So the pay is usually low. Policemen, firemen, teachers, they don't get paid that much. So what does the government have to do? They have to create the sense of nobility in doing them, because that's the only way to encourage people to want to get into those fields. If you didn't make teaching a noble cause,
right,
who's going to go work for a government school?
Right.
Instead, you're going to go find an opportunity to teach where somebody's going to pay you something worthwhile to do it. And what we have to teach people is know your worth, know what your value is, learn how to be productive, and that you should get compensated for your worth, and you can do something noble and get compensated for it. Profit is not a bad thing. Earning a living and doing something noble at the same time is possible. Don't just go do it because the government says you should, and that's a good thing to do.
I'm going to suggest that we pick this back up next week because we need to wrap up here. But there is something really big here that's worth digging into. And here's the question I'm going to leave us with, and we'll pick this back up. Is many Americans will say they really value education. Education is really important. We value education, and at the same time, those same Americans don't value it enough to pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
They will pay for a new big screen TV or a new car, right? They'll save up and pay. But when it comes to their own kids, they actually want someone else to pay for it. So they don't really value it that much. And they certainly don't value it enough to pay their own, the people who teach their kids. They don't want to pay them $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 in salaries. They're quite comfortable if those teachers are getting paid $30,000 or $40,000 or $50,000.
Mm-hmm.
And so that question of what do people really value and how much do they value it, what it means to work for a government agency versus working for a business, and the different kinds of incentives, I think we should pick those up in our next discussion.
I have a lot to say on that, so we definitely will.
Until then, though, we're going to keep guarding the American idea. We're going to keep doing what we can do to remind Americans of the arts and the virtues necessary to live as free citizens.
And remember that human nature doesn't change.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we say Nos Sumus Custodes.
That's right.